Scientists in Florida are sounding the alarm over what they're calling a wildlife issue of our time.
Everyone knows the Everglades has a python problem. It's been in the news for years. Giant snakes hauled out of the swamp, snake hunting competitions, viral photos of gator-versus-python standoffs. But this is the genuinely scary part. The pythons might not even be the most dangerous thing biologists have found out there. While every camera stayed focused on the snake, something microscopic was spreading through Florida's native wildlife in total silence. Something that hitched a ride on the python and has since learned to survive without it entirely. It's already infected dozens of species and pushed hundreds of miles beyond anywhere a python has ever lived. So what is this strange thing, and how is it quietly taking over the Everglades? Let's get into it. The roads go quiet. The story starts with Dr. Frank Mazzotti, who has been studying the Everglades since the 1980s. He says that back in the 80s and the 90s, you could drive the back roads near the Everglades and barely go a few hundred yards without slowing down for something. A raccoon crossing, a rabbit in the headlights, deer moving through the sawgrass at the edge of the beam. By the 2000s, that had changed. Those animals became fewer and fewer. Dr. Mazzotti and his team took notice of the situation. They started driving fixed routes at night and counting every animal they saw. From 2003 to 2011, they logged nearly 57,000 kilometers of road, and the numbers that came back were staggering. Raccoon sightings had dropped by 99.3%. Opossum sightings fell 98.9%. Bobcat sightings dropped 87.5%. Rabbits weren't detected at all. They published their findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012. It remains one of the biggest documented collapses of a mammal community ever. This is so much more than just a story about a few missing animals. Mammals are the backbones of the food web. They spread seeds. They control insects. They're the meal ticket for foxes, birds of prey, and the endangered Florida panther. Take them out, and everything above them in the Everglades ecosystem collapses. And if that happens, the damage to Florida will be catastrophic. This is because the Everglades does so much more than give some nice scenery and an influx of tourism. It filters drinking water for millions of people in South Florida. It absorbs storm surge during hurricane season. It recharges the water channels that keep the taps running in one of the fastest-growing regions in the country. Economists who work with the Everglades Foundation have put the value of the services this ecosystem performs at more than $31 billion a year. When the mammal population collapses, that entire system is put at risk. That brings us to the million-dollar question. How did this happen? To understand that, you have to go back to a night in August of 1992, when the sky itself tried to warn Florida of what was coming: the storm. On August 24, 1992, Hurricane Andrew slammed into South Florida. A Category 5 storm with sustained winds over 165 miles per hour. 65 people were killed, $27 billion in damages. It remains one of the most destructive hurricanes in American history. However, buried in that wreckage was a detail that wouldn't matter for years. Andrew tore apart a reptile breeding facility south of Miami. It was one of several exotic animal operations in the region. State inspectors who surveyed the damage afterward reported that thousands of exotic animals had escaped during the storm. Multiple witnesses described seeing large snakes loose in the area. A python breeding operation was among the facilities destroyed, and an unknown number of Burmese pythons slipped into the surrounding wetlands that night. For years, that hurricane got the blame for the entire python invasion. But it's not the whole truth. There's a second half to this story that gets less attention. Burmese pythons were, and still are, popular in the exotic pet trade. Hatchlings are small and manageable. Adults are not. An adult Burmese python can reach 15 to 18 feet long and weigh well over 100 pounds. Plenty of owners brought home a cute 2-foot snake and later found themselves with an animal too large and too dangerous to keep in a house. Some of those owners made a decision that felt at the time, like the humane thing to do. They drove to the Everglades and let the snake go. What they didn't realize is that they weren't setting an animal free. They were giving an ecosystem a predator it had never dealt with before, in an environment made for that predator to thrive in. Built to win. The Everglades is more than 1.5 million acres of subtropical wetland. Warm and humid every day of the year, packed with prey that had never seen anything like the Burmese python. The natives of the region had spent thousands of years evolving around Florida's native predators: alligators, bobcats, panthers. But a Burmese python doesn't hunt like anything native to Florida. It's an ambush predator that can lie motionless in a few inches of water for hours. It is practically invisible until it strikes. Florida's native prey animals had no defense for this, and pythons don't reproduce like most predators either. A single female can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in one clutch. She'll coil around them for weeks, regulating her own body temperature to keep them warm until they hatch. No native predator in Florida had ever had to contend with a reptile that reproduces at such a high speed. To make matters worse, the Burmese python is only vulnerable in its first 2 years of life. Once a python survives those first 2 years, it faces almost no threats in the Everglades. With abundant food, no real predators, and a reproductive strategy built for rapid expansion, the python population went completely out of control. Exact numbers are hard to pin down because Burmese pythons are so good at hiding, but estimates generally range from somewhere in the 10,000s up to as many as 300,000. An apex predator that didn't exist in this ecosystem 20 years ago now numbers in the hundreds of thousands. And the 2012 study showed the consequences of this invasion. It was the moment researchers finally had hard numbers to match what people on the ground had been saying for years. Something out there was eating the Everglades from the inside. The consequences of that are far-reaching. An ecosystem valued at tens of billions of dollars a year in flood control and water filtration alone starts to wobble at the foundation. When researchers understood just how bad the situation was, they began devoting all their time and energy to finding solutions. The first and biggest problem they faced was that the snakes were incredibly hard to find. They blended seamlessly into their surroundings and were masters of staying hidden. To overcome that challenge, officials came up with one of the most innovative snake hunting programs ever created: the Impossible Hunt. The biologists at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida had been looking for a solution for a long time, and they finally got a breakthrough. In 2013, the team of scientists, led by Ian Bartoshak, came up with a strategy to surgically implant radio transmitters into male pythons. Once implanted, they release the pythons back into the wild. When it's breeding season, these male pythons, called scout snakes, go looking for a mate. They lead the researchers straight to the breeding females. Since it began, this program has now helped biologists remove more than 20 tons of python biomass from a 200-square-mile stretch of land. In recent breeding seasons, there have been clear signs that this strategy is working. Scout snakes have had a harder time finding mates at all, and the females they do find tend to be smaller than in years past. There have also been initiatives at the governmental level that have helped in the fight against the pythons. One of these is the Florida Python Challenge, an annual public hunting competition. In 2024, roughly 857 participants combined to remove 195 pythons over 10 days. The most recent 2025 event recorded 934 hunters and turned in 294 snakes. This was the best result in the challenge's history. Florida also employs professional contractors year-round through the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, along with the South Florida Water Management District. Since the professional program launched in 2017, the contractors have removed more than 14,000 pythons. Combined with public reporting since the year 2000, the statewide total now sits above 23,000 snakes removed. It sounds like a lot, But against an estimated population in the tens or hundreds of thousands, it's just a small dent, not even close to a solution, and it gets worse. The snakes themselves seem to be adapting. They are retreating deeper into terrain where hunters rarely go, making the population that remains progressively harder to reach. And while all of that was happening in plain sight, researchers were noticing something wrong with animals that had nothing to do with pythons at all. The second invasion. Scientists doing routine health checks on native snakes started finding animals that were emaciated, sluggish, and struggling to breathe. When they examined the bodies, they found the problem in their lungs. Dense tangles of small, pale, worm-like organisms, alive and moving. They were packed into the airways of animals that were slowly suffocating. The organism is called Rhaelia orientalis, commonly known as the snake lungworm. It's native to Southeast Asia, where it lives inside the lungs of wild Burmese pythons and other hosts. Over millions of years, pythons and this parasite developed a working relationship. The Burmese python's immune system keeps the infection in check well enough that it rarely causes serious harm. It's a carrier, not a victim, and the pythons carried this parasite all the way to Florida, where the native snakes never evolved to have any kind of defense against it. Their immune systems have no experience with this organism at all. They never developed to deal with the lungworm. The consequences have been severe. Melissa Miller at the University of Florida and Terrence Farrell at Stetson University have documented the parasite in at least 18 native Florida snake species. The infection has now been found as far north as Jacksonville, hundreds of miles from where Burmese pythons actually live. It is almost impossible to contain because of the way it spreads. An infected snake sheds parasite eggs in its waste. Cockroaches, which are everywhere in the Everglades, eat that waste and pick up the larvae. A frog eats the cockroach. A native snake eats the frog. That's an entirely normal food chain doing exactly what it's always done. Except now, every link in it can carry a parasite that didn't exist in Florida 30 years ago. After entering the snake's body, the larvae burrow through the stomach wall and migrate to the lungs. There, the parasites grow and reproduce until the airways become so clogged that the snake can no longer breathe. And here's the part that worries researchers most. The lungworm no longer needs the python at all. It is now spreading through native cockroaches, frogs, and snakes, infecting more and more native snake populations as it goes. Even if every python in Florida vanished tomorrow, the lungworm would keep spreading on its own. So Florida is now fighting two invasions at once. Pythons hollowing out the mammal population from the top of the food chain. A parasite quietly working through the reptile community from the bottom. And in the middle of that fight, wildlife officials made a decision that, at first glance, looked like they'd lost their minds. The emperor returns. Florida wildlife officials announced they'd be releasing hundreds of snakes into the wild. On purpose. The backlash was immediate, and mostly came from people who stopped reading after that first sentence. The snake in question wasn't an invader. It was the eastern indigo snake, the longest native snake in North America. It is capable of growing past 8 feet, with scales so deeply black they flash blue and green in direct sunlight. It's also completely native to the southeastern United States, and it had been functionally wiped out of North Florida for over 50 years. The eastern indigo is a snake eater. It's immune to the venom of every pit viper in North America, such as rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads. It simply overpowers them with raw strength and swallows them whole while they're still trying to bite back. In the Everglades, almost nothing can actually challenge an adult indigo snake. So how did they even go extinct from Florida in the first place? The problem was habitat. Eastern indigos depend on deep underground tunnels for shelter. Florida's development boom converted native longleaf pine forest into farmland and suburbs. When that happened, the underground tunnels had basically become extinct, and the indigos went with them. By the late 1970s, the species was essentially gone from North Florida. The Oriane Society worked with its partners, the Nature Conservancy and the Central Florida Zoo's Oriane Center for Indigo Conservation. They spent years rebuilding entire longleaf pine ecosystems in the Florida Panhandle before releasing a single snake. They were not just planting trees. They were restoring the fire cycles the forest depends on and bringing back the underground tunnel systems created by gopher tortoises, where indigo snakes spend much of their time. Since 2017, the program has released well over 200 captive-bred eastern indigos in the Everglades. Then, in the fall of 2023, biologists monitoring the site got the news they'd been working toward for years. 2 wild-born eastern indigo hatchlings were discovered on the property. Not released animals, but offspring, born in the wild. It was the first confirmed evidence in over 50 years that eastern indigo snakes were reproducing on their own in North Florida. The eastern indigo snake's return matters for more than just conservation records, because it is a natural snake hunter. It hunts other snakes for a living. This was the reason why it was so important that this snake be brought back to the Everglades. It is one of the last remaining hopes for the Everglades to survive the python invasion. That hope became much more real when researchers found that some of Florida's native wildlife was actually capable of killing a Burmese python. The fight back. In December 2022, one of the radio-tagged scout pythons led researchers to an unexpected discovery. The severed head of a Burmese python lay hidden beneath a layer of pine needles. Most of the body had already been eaten. A trail camera overlooking the site revealed what had happened. A bobcat had killed the snake. The predator weighed only about 25 pounds. The python stretched roughly 13 feet long and weighed more than 50 pounds. It was the first documented case of a bobcat killing a Burmese python in Florida. At first, one dead python might not sound like much, but for researchers, it challenged an idea that had been hanging over the Everglades for decades, that once a python became established, almost nothing in Florida could fight back. The bobcat showed that wasn't entirely true. Florida's native predators were still capable of killing these snakes under the right circumstances. That discovery made scientists even more optimistic about another predator they had already spent years trying to restore. The eastern indigo snake doesn't just defend itself against other snakes, it hunts them. Unlike bobcats, alligators, or panthers, which usually encounter pythons by chance, the eastern indigo actively searches for snakes as prey. Hunting them is part of its natural behavior. That makes the timing especially important. A Burmese python is most vulnerable during its first 2 years of life. After that, it grows so large that very few animals can challenge it. Young pythons, however, are exactly the size an eastern indigo would normally hunt. If enough juvenile pythons were removed before they reached breeding age, fewer females would survive to lay the next generation of eggs. Over time, that could slow the invasion in a way that hunting adult snakes never could. Researchers haven't yet documented an eastern indigo killing a Burmese python, so they are careful not to present it as the answer. But for the first time, there is a scientifically plausible reason to believe that Florida may eventually have a native predator capable of putting real pressure on the python population. Whether that hope becomes reality is still unknown. Right now, the Everglades is caught between 2 invasions. Burmese pythons continue to reshape the mammal population, while the snake lungworm spreads through native reptiles without needing the python anymore. At the same time, the eastern indigo is only beginning to reclaim the habitat it lost more than 50 years ago. The race is now on. Today, the future of the Everglades is still being written. Researchers are removing pythons, restoring native habitat, and bringing back species that disappeared decades ago. But whether those efforts will be enough is something only time can answer. The next few years could determine what the Everglades looks like for generations to come. So, what do you think? Can Florida actually turn this around, or has too much damage already been done? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next mystery we dig into. We'll see you in the next one.